I heard about a man who was looking for a job and his eyes fell upon an opening at a local zoo. And so he went and took his resume and filled out the necessary application and paperwork and sat down to inquire about the particular position they were looking for because they weren't real clear. And they wanted to just evaluate who it was that was going to come for the interview. And so they went ahead and let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, and told him the position they were looking for. They needed somebody to dress up in a gorilla suit for a few days because the real gorilla had just passed away, and there was going to be some lag time before they got a new one. And they had spent a great deal of money to have a gorilla suit made that looked like the real thing. And all he needed to do was put on the gorilla suit and basically just sit there in his habitat for observation and basically just eat and sleep. And of course, his identity would be kept a secret and no one would be the wiser thanks to a very fine gorilla suit. And so they offered him a good deal of money and he tried on the suit and sure enough, he passed. And so the next day he reported for work and they led him to the cage and he took a position in the back of the cage and pretended to be asleep when the zoo opened and people began to stream into the zoo that day. And after a while, he just got tired of just laying there. And so he sat up and he noticed when he sat up, people began to stir. And he kind of liked the fact that he'd caused them to stir. And so he decided to get up and walk around doing his best gorilla walk in his gorilla suit. And people began to gather there outside of the habitat and kids began to stir. And so he decided to start jumping up and down. And he heard the kids giggling, and people started throwing peanuts into his habitat. And he got really excited because he liked peanuts. And he would jump around some more, and people were throwing peanuts, and people were excited, and he loved the attention. And this seemed to really get the crowd going, and so he decided to really stretch things out as the day went on. He grabbed a vine, and he swung from one tree to another there in his habitat, and people oohed and awed, and he just noticed that the more he swung and the higher he went, the bigger the crowd got, and he really dug the attention. And finally, he swung so high that he lost control of the vine, and he wound up in the air, passing over the dividing barrier, separating his habitat from the habitat of the next creature, which happened to be a lion. And he came tumbling into the lion's habitat. And the next thing he knew, there was a huge lion 20 feet away, closing on him. And the guy in the gorilla suit started jumping up and down, trying to scream. He couldn't get anything out. And before he knew it, that lion had pounced on him, and he barely got the words out. "Get me out of here. I'm a man, I'm not a gorilla. Help, help." And before he knew it, that lion had his paw over his mouth and said, "Shut up, you're gonna get us both fired." Some folks are pretty good at pretending. Some people are so good at pretending they can make a living at it. And you know what? Like I talked about last week, not all pretending is necessarily bad. There is some pretending and some posing in our culture that can be for very good reasons. I think of undercover officers who protect us posing as something else. I think of actors who entertain us and bring us laughter. But a life of pretending is something different altogether. So if you're with us for the very first time, we are in the midst of just a short series that I'm calling it Keeping It Real, Help for Hypocrites. And if you came because someone invited you today, it's because they're trying to tell you something. Not really, I'm just messing with you. The reality is we all need help keeping it real. All of us do. Because there's so much pretending in our world. Until Jesus came along, hypocrite was rather a benign word. It wasn't a negative word. All it meant in the ancient world was a stage actor. So somebody who pretends to be somebody else on stage. That's all it meant. And in Greek theater, of Jesus' day, an actor would often play multiple roles in the same play. And so the actor would come in from one side of the stage with a particular mask, and it would be a mask that was a smiling mask, and he would deliver one-liners that would make people laugh or lighten the moment. Then later on in the play, he would enter from the other side wearing a frowning mask as he delivered solemn or sad or sobering lines. Now, this actor who would play multiple roles in a performance was called a hypocrite. It just meant that's somebody who wore two faces. But when Jesus came along and used that word, it completely turned things upside down, because Jesus took the word and began to adopt it to talk about people in real life. People who will pose, who will pretend, who will wear a mask in order to accomplish some kind of self-serving agenda. Jesus put hypocrisy on the map in the way that you and I think of hypocrisy today. 17 times in the Gospels, Jesus uses the word hypocrite or speaks of hypocrisy. And then the writers of the New Testament letters follow suit. For instance, Paul addressed hypocrisy in places like Galatians chapter 2 when he called out a fellow apostle named Peter for hypocrisy, which I'll show you that story here in just a second. But it so impacted Peter that later he writes in one of his letters to the church in 1 Peter 2, he calls for believers to rid yourselves of all hypocrisy. Now, Peter tells believers this. Peter tells people who are attempting to walk with Jesus. These are people who are walking with Jesus and following Jesus, and he tells them to rid themselves of all hypocrisy. The fact that Peter was still dealing with hypocrisy, even though he's an apostle in Galatians 2, the fact that Peter tells followers of Jesus to get rid of all hypocrisy tells you something, that hypocrisy can still creep up on you, even as a believer. No matter who we are, how long we followed Jesus, this can creep up on us. This is why Jesus told his followers in Luke chapter 12 and verse 1, hey, watch out for hypocrisy. And he didn't mean watch out for it in the lives of everyone else. He meant watch out for it in our own lives. Why? Because it's easier to fall into posing and pretending and into wearing masks than we think. So what I want to do with you for this particular message is I just want to touch on what are a couple of reasons why we're prone to hypocrisy. Why are we prone to pretending? Why is that such a temptation? I can think of two fundamental reasons. One is some pose looking to gain something. Some pose looking to gain something. And so last week, I showed you in Matthew chapter 6, we won't read it again, but you can look at it later. Matthew 6, 1 through 18, Jesus talks about the hypocrites who announced their giving with trumpets, who prayed out loud on street corners, who fasted with pained look on their faces so people would know that they're fasting. And he said those particular people that he was calling attention to were doing all of that for the sake of being seen, for the sake of being honored, for the sake of being respected. And again, I just shared with you last week, a lot of people think hypocrisy is just when somebody is living unrighteously who claims to be about pursuing righteousness. In Jesus' examples in Matthew chapter 6, that's not hypocrisy. Hypocrisy oftentimes is you can be doing the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 was saying there are some people who are giving, who are praying, who are fasting in particular ways to bring or for them to gain honor, respect, and esteem for others. His beef wasn't necessarily with the fact of people giving publicly, praying publicly, or fasting publicly, because there are times in Scripture where that's affirmed. His beef was with these people who he said the intent of these people's hearts is they are doing these things to incur esteem, honor, respect. It was the way they were going about it and the why. They were doing holy things, but for unholy reasons. Now, Jesus went after these same religious leaders again later in Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence." He's getting after them. He's saying you're out to gain something. Blind Pharisee, First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woo! It's a smoking passage there. Now, if you read everything that Jesus says about hypocrisy in the Gospels, like I said last week, it seems to always concern religious leaders and religious people. And again, I just want to address this. Somebody might be thinking, man, that's why I don't want anything to do with the church and religion. It's so full of hypocrisy. And I would again just remind you that hypocrisy, pretending, and posing isn't something that's unique to religion and church. You find it everywhere. A little while back, I was reading about some of the most recent ways single men are trying to impress women and get a date. Some of them are using what's called a rogue ATM receipt. On one side, it looks like a receipt from an ATM transaction, a very good imitation, which, you know, in ATM receipts, they list withdrawal and deposit numbers, and they'll list your balance. For $3.99, you can get a pack of 24 rogue ATM receipts. Now, I'm not going to tell you how you can do this, okay? I don't want to encourage you, but you can do the research. So if you're in the midst of a conversation and you want to hand the woman your number, you fumble around your pocket, you pull out what appears to be this old receipt, you just turn over the back of it, and maybe you write your number down. You don't even need to say anything about what's on the other side of the sheet. If you give somebody a sheet of paper with something written on it, I promise you, they are going to look on the other side of it when they get home. And in due time, the woman sees that, oh, there's this number of $347,223.72 on the receipt. And the chances are better than 50-50 they'll call or text. Now, you might be thinking, poor girl. But then again, if she calls, is she pretending and posing herself? I mean, what are the chances that the number on the receipt made the guy more attractive to her than he really was? Who's getting played? In the end, both of them might be playing each other. Posing, pretending, hypocrisy for the sake of trying to gain something for yourself. It's not just religion, it's everywhere. But that's not the only reason people pose, pretend, or wear a mask. Some pose out of fear of losing something. And we see this in an interesting story in Galatians 2. I shared with you one passage, Matthew 23, where Pharisees are posing to gain something. In Galatians chapter 2, you have someone posing out of fear of losing something. Peter is with the church in Antioch. The church in Antioch is very diverse. It's made up of Jewish people who've come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and Gentile people who've come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. Some of you probably remember what a big deal this was. Jews and Gentiles in this church now learning to eat together in one place, worshiping together, working together based on the common ground of what they have in Jesus. He had destroyed the dividing wall between the two of them. But that wasn't what any of the Jewish people were brought up to do. And so some of the Jewish church leaders from the mother church in Jerusalem, made up of primarily just Jewish people who've come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, but they're still getting used to this idea that the Gentiles can be in on the favor of God through Jesus, just as much as the Jews can, you know. They're still getting used to that. And so some of the leaders from the church in Jerusalem come down to check out the church in Antioch, because the church in Antioch has Jews and Gentiles worshiping together, praying together, eating together, and that some of the church leaders from the church in Jerusalem just don't know if they're ready for this yet. Now, Peter is a Jewish believer who's in Antioch. He's been fellowshipping with Gentile Christians. He's been eating with them. He's been hanging with them. You even know the story from Acts chapter 10. It's Peter that helps bring a Gentile named Cornelius to the Lord in Acts chapter 10. Peter knows what Jesus has done. Peter knows that Jesus is creating a whole new movement where the Jews and Gentiles can be one through him. Peter knows it's okay, potentially, to eat bacon. Peter knows that all foods are clean now. And he's hanging out with the Gentile believers, fellowshipping with the Gentile believers. But then guess what? The Jewish believers from the mother church in Jerusalem, from headquarters, show up. And Peter is not ready to be seen by the Jewish church leaders back at headquarters. He's not ready to be seen eating with the Gentiles or fellowshipping with them. And so what happens when the Jewish church leaders show up from Jerusalem? Peter acts like he doesn't even know the Gentiles. He won't eat with them. He won't fellowship with them. And even more than that, Peter starts requiring the Gentiles to observe Jewish customs. He never did that before. Can you imagine how the Gentile believers felt when all of a sudden Peter, who was hanging with them, eating with them, worshiping with them, fellowshipping with them, now Peter won't talk to them. And now Peter's even requiring things of them. And the Gentiles had to be baffled and hurt. So what does the Apostle Paul do? Paul's a brother of Peter. He sees what's going on. He calls Peter out on it. Can you imagine this? See, a lot of people, if they don't read the whole Bible, I'm telling you what, there are times when you see believers having a hard time with one another. Even the apostles were having to work things out. Paul writes in Galatians 2, "So I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned." He's telling people in Galatia this story. "For before certain men came from James," James was the head of the church in Jerusalem, "before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group." Peter was afraid. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, that's so interesting, that's Peter, but Paul calls Peter by his old name. Oh, we could preach on that, but we won't. We'll keep going. He said, "I said to Cephas in front of them all, 'You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew.'" In other words, he's calling him out. When the Jewish leaders aren't in town, you live like a Gentile. You know? But when they come to town, you're like the people that put up their wine when the pastor comes over for dinner. You thought I didn't know. And he says, you know this. You're a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs, Bubba, when you don't even follow Jewish customs? Paul says it quite plainly. What fueled Peter's hypocrisy was fear. He was afraid of the crew from Jerusalem. So he acted like something was wrong associating with Gentiles when it wasn't. Not only that, but because he was a person of influence, he wound up leading others astray down that same path, thus bringing division to the church and hurting his new Gentile brothers and sisters. Peter was posing out of fear of losing something. He was pretending like something was wrong when it wasn't. He was pretending a group of people were in the wrong when they weren't. He was pretending it would be wrong for him to associate with them. Whew. Powerful stuff. So it can happen to anyone. And here you have Peter, who God uses incredibly. It's Peter that launches the church in Acts. It's Peter that writes 1st and 2nd Peter. It's Peter that does so many things, but even Peter gets caught up in this and is dealing with the hypocrisy that's fueled by fear of losing something, fear of losing respect, or just fear of losing acceptance from people who he esteems. Paul calls him out on it. But this kind of thing just doesn't happen in church. It happens everywhere. It happens in school lunchrooms. It happens in offices. It happens in bunco groups, around poker tables. It happens in gyms. It happens at country clubs, where people withdraw from others out of fear from what others might be thinking. When people mask themselves as though I don't know them. It even happens in zoos. I cracked up not too long ago in China. One of the largest zoos in China got caught posing. They were attempting to pass off large dogs as lions, with some expensive cosmetic work and prosthetics. Can you even imagine? They almost pulled it off until the lion barked. And that got investigators curious. After the lion started barking, they were wondering what else is going on in this zoo, and the mask was quickly pulled off. But they were really stunned to find out this was happening in other habitats in the zoo. Lo and behold, the zebras weren't zebras after all. They were donkeys that had stripes painted on them. The zoo folks went on to confess they couldn't get lions and zebras quickly enough to replace the real ones. They were afraid of losing business. It's amazing what fear of losing something can do. How it can drive you to pose, to pretend, to wear a mask in all sorts of ways. You'll be willing to metaphorically paint a stripe on a donkey. And haven't some of us done that? Painted stripes on a donkey out of fear of losing something. Maybe the people we love, or acceptance, or money, or opportunities, or respect, or votes. But stripes on a donkey doesn't make it a zebra. And by the way, this fear of losing something that's at the heart of pretending is often why we pretend to never do anything wrong or never have anything to apologize for. This is why some people have such trouble owning something that they did that's wrong, because they are fearful. They're scared. They're scared of losing something, respect, or a job, or acceptance. They're scared. But posing can take a toll on us. For instance, posing, it can be exhausting. Do you remember the movie Miss Doubtfire? Robin Williams plays that divorced dad who's looking for a way to be with his children every day. His ex-wife is masterfully played by Sally Fields. She's interviewing for prospects to serve as nannies for her children while they work, and he is so desperate to be around his children, to be back in the home that he used to share with his wife and family. And so with all kinds of cosmetics and prosthetics, he transforms himself into an old German woman by the name of Mrs. Doubtfire. She interviews for the job. She gets the job. And he starts showing up to work in the house that he used to live in every day. The nanny to the kids, and the kids weren't any, they didn't know it at first. His ex-wife doesn't know it. But when he's off duty, if you remember, he goes to look for work, and the whole plot thickens to this hilarious climax when he is to interview with a television executive at a restaurant on the same night that Mrs. Doubtfire, his alter ego, is supposed to be with Sally, his ex-wife, and the kids, and his ex-wife's new boyfriend for a birthday dinner at that same restaurant. And he doesn't want to cancel the interview, and he doesn't want to not show up for the birthday dinner, and so Mrs. Doubtfire goes back and forth between two tables at both ends of the restaurant. Robin Williams is changing in and out of Mrs. Doubtfire's costume in the bathroom. And you watch this frenetic activity as he keeps asking to be excused to the bathroom, first for the TV executive and then from his family. He keeps changing in the bathroom, and eventually things are moving so fast he gets confused, and he sits down as Mrs. Doubtfire at the table of the TV executive. It becomes unsustainable. He can't keep it up. Some of us have had Mrs. Doubtfire moments. We We can't keep up appearances. It's exhausting and unsustainable over the long haul. If you've ever lied for a time to try and survive and you've tried to keep up with the lies, you understand this. It brings to mind an old line. Remember this line: you can walk in integrity, but you can't outrun the truth. There's so much to that. Living with integrity means it's a sustainable pace. Like the old person told you, if you always tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you said. It's a sustainable pace. But you can't outrun the truth. And once you start lying and masking and posing and pretending, the pace gets faster and faster and faster. It still doesn't keep some folks from trying, though. Hypocrisy takes a toll. Posing can be self-deceiving. On multiple places in Scripture, we're told not to deceive ourselves. Jeremiah 37:9, 1 Corinthians 3 and 18, James 1 and 22. I can show you passages. They're there in the sermon notes on the app. We're told not to deceive ourselves. Have you ever met someone who was so good at posing or pretending, or they even lied so much that they had trouble really knowing what the truth was anymore? That's possible. Some people are so incredibly good at lying and lie so much and pretend so much, they're not even sure what the truth is anymore. Nathaniel Hawthorne said, "No man can for any considerable time wear one face to himself and another to the multitude without finally getting bewildered as to which is the true one." And we can spend so much time working on the outside that we begin to think we are really on the inside what we're projecting on the outside, when in reality we can be dying on the inside. We can look good on the outside, but we're like a whitewashed tomb. We're dead on the inside. But it can be self-deceiving, posing and pretending. And finally, it can be repelling. You know, study after study of adults in their 20s and 30s and how they feel about Christianity and organized religion in general, study after study has revealed that the biggest single thing determining their perspective on Christianity and faith right now is how they saw their parents or primary guardians live it at home in their formative years growing up. Now, there's a lot, it's no secret right now that organized Christianity is in decline in America. The facts are indisputable. We could talk about why some other time. In fact, I'm going to talk some about this later this year, why that is. And there are several variables. But one of the things, the fundamental thing for many people these days in their 20s and 30s that affects how they view Christianity, how they view the Christian faith, has a lot to do with whether or not their caregivers, their guardians, or their parents, when they were growing up, were seen as really seeking to live into it at home. Now, when I say this, I don't mean whether or not the parents live perfectly. Don't get me wrong. That's not what the study was revealing. I meant live it faithfully. You say, Chris, what's the difference between living it faithfully and living it perfectly? I mean this. Living it faithfully means owning it in the times when we don't live it. One of the most important things that we can do as a mom or dad raising young adults, young kids, is own it when they've witnessed us saying or doing the wrong thing. And listen, it's incredibly humbling to have to do it. It is. It doesn't feel good to own it in front of your kids. But it doesn't diminish your testimony. If anything, you become more real to them. And I want to tell you what, our kids will have opportunities to learn that we need Jesus too. There are times when we even remind our own 3 sons, you know what? Mom and dad need Jesus too. It's quite possible you may still be in counseling 10 years from now because of us. Go ahead and say it. It'll set you free, man. You know? We need Jesus too. What diminishes our testimony is when we can never acknowledge our own stuff. That's what diminishes our testimony. And I'll just go ahead and say this. If I'm raising my children and my children never have heard me say, I am sorry and take ownership for something I have done, or said to their mama or to them or to another human being, I'm telling you, I am doing it wrong. Because in the course of growing up in my household and being exposed to me over a lifetime, I'm going to sin. I'm going to fail. But it doesn't have to diminish your testimony if you're willing to own it. Amen? Because we need Jesus too. Hypocrisy isn't inconsistency like I talked about last week. It's not inconsistency. All of us fall short. Hypocrisy is when you keep pretending that you never fall short and you never can own anything that you've done that's wrong. Lee Strobel is a noted Christian author who's written books such as The Case for Faith and The Case for Christ. Some of you have probably read his books. What a lot of people don't know is that Strobel, he did not become a follower of Jesus until he was well into adulthood. He was an award-winning journalist and agnostic for the Chicago Tribune. But eventually he came to faith in Jesus in Chicago. He committed his life to following Jesus. Strobel's daughter was growing up in his home when he came to faith in Jesus. Before he came to faith in Jesus, she was witnessed. He was an angry and profane man, physically violent at times. So much so she'd hide in a room during his tantrums. When he came to Jesus, he began to own his displays. He wasn't transformed overnight, but he began to make progress. But still, when he would slip up, when he was exploding, he would manage to own his displays. He would acknowledge them and he would apologize to her. Strobel was in the midst of unraveling some very destructive patterns with his rage and with his anger. And he was very much in tune for how far he had to go as a follower of Jesus. And yet, his daughter, who was still a little shy with her daddy, still within a year of him following Jesus, came to her mother one night and said as a teenager, Mom, I want Jesus to do for me what I see him doing for Dad. She hadn't been exposed to his perfection. He wasn't perfect, but he was authentic and he was apologetic, and that went a long way. It didn't repel her. It drew her. If you're paying attention right now, Major League Baseball is giving you a ringside seat right now to the futility of posing. And here's what I'm saying. There's a lot of talk about the Houston Astros, or as some would say, the Houston Asterisk, cheating and the punishment that's been given by Major League Baseball. But there's even what people aren't talking about much is the damage happening to the relationships of the players behind the scenes. Buster Olney covers Major League Baseball full time. He's friends with hundreds of major leaguers. This tweet of his on Wednesday said so much. He said, over the last 2 months, some members of the Astros reached out to friends with other teams to assure them they didn't cheat to win. In wake of the commissioner's report, which presented evidence otherwise, some of those friendships are fractured. Lots of anger. Posing takes a toll. What's the pose for them? Yeah, there was some cheating, but the pose was how people responded when they were suspected or caught of cheating. And for 2 months, they're telling everybody, we didn't do it. And it's a mask. See, I don't think inconsistency, I don't think when people fail to live up to the standard that they're seeking to live to, I don't think inconsistency necessarily diminishes always your testimony. It can harm it for a season, but the real key is how do you respond when you're caught or when you're convicted about it? Will you own it? Posing takes a toll. No wonder Jesus spoke with such passion about it. And yet, this same Jesus who spoke with such power about hypocrisy is also the same Jesus who offers such hope for the hypocrite. And isn't that good news? Because we've all been there. So how do you get rid of it? As Peter talked about in 1 Peter 2. I'll talk more about that next week, but I'll wrap up with this. It's through Jesus that we find the security to shatter the mask. You see, it's Jesus and what he taught about how dearly we are loved and how much we mean to him that can make all the difference in the world in how enslaved I am when I'm trying to impress others. On the days when my sense of worth is tied more to what he thinks of me, on the days when my sense of worth is tied more to the fact that he's died for me, I find I'm less inclined to pretend and pose in order to impress others because I know where I stand with him. I also find that when my sense of worth is wrapped up in what he teaches about me and in his death for me, I'm also more inclined to own it when I've fallen short, and I'm less inclined to keep pretending as though I haven't fallen short. It's worth noting that when you read Jesus' challenge to his disciples about not being like the hypocrites in Matthew chapter 6, 1 through 18, over and over he keeps reminding them that they have a Father in heaven. 9 times in 18 verses. Jesus keeps saying, your Father, your Father, your Father. And it's not just to remind them that, hey, God knows the truth, he sees your heart. It's to remind them that he carries them close to his heart. They have a Father, because I'm going to tell you what, at the root of most hypocrisy is just profound insecurity. Behind most of our struggles with hypocrisy are really, we're just scared little boys and scared little girls, trying to either gain something or fearful of losing something. Knowing who it is that your Father has a way of providing the kind of security that enables you to start letting down the mask. And it's Jesus who will teach you about who you really are and then who dies that you might be restored to him. And that's why the cross of Jesus is so powerful when it comes to dealing with my hypocrisy. Because on one level, it makes me face the truth that I've sinned, and there's no sense me pretending like I haven't. And yet it reminds me of how dearly loved I am, even as a sinner. And even more than that, it opens the way for me to be cleansed of sin and to be clothed in his righteousness. And the more aware you are of being clothed in the righteousness of Jesus, the less interested you are in being in a costume of anything else. And even more than that, when you're cleansed, you can be filled with the Spirit of God who's going to transform you from the inside out so that you can be the real thing. And you don't have to settle for being a donkey with painted stripes. I'm going to ask those serving communion to be going to their places. I want to give us a few moments just to come before the Lord, our hearts and all. I want to ask you a couple questions as we take communion. What's helped you to no longer pretend or pose? Because some of you, you've made progress, but what's helped you to no longer pretend or pose? Kind of look back on that. How has God helped you? And then secondly, what is it you would ask God to do in your heart today? Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for your presence. And Lord, we want to be all in. We want a faith and a relationship with you that goes far beyond skin deep, into the core of our hearts. And we thank you for the security we find in Jesus to learn how to let down the mask and to allow you to work on us from the inside out. We thank you for the people who loved us and pursued us when we've been posing and pretending, who wouldn't give up on us. We pray you will give us wisdom and grace and patience with people we love who are doing the same out of fear right now, and that you would use us to help them know they can let down the mask and find freedom in you. Through Christ, amen.